In this lecture, we're going to learn about default constructors. And this is a syntax you can use to let the compiler generate a default constructor for you. All you have to do is do things like this. You're going to say the name of the constructor, which is going to be the same name as the class. You're going to put in an empty parameter list, and then you're going to say equals default. If you do this, the compiler is going to generate a default empty constructor for you. In the last lecture, we have seen that we can set up our own constructors basically like this. What I haven't told you is that the moment you set up your own constructor, the compiler is going to not generate the default constructor. And if you want to keep the ability to construct objects without passing parameters, you're going to have to put in your own default constructor, and you can use this syntax here to do that. Let's head over to Visual Studio Code and talk about this a little more. Okay, here we are in our working folder. The current project is defaulted constructors. We're going to grab our template files and we're going to put them in place. And we are going to open this in Visual Studio Code by dragging and dropping here. And we're going to open our main CPP file. Let's take out what we don't need. We're going to clean the main function here. And we are going to bring in the class definition we had in the last lecture. If you remember, we had two constructors and one constructor which didn't take any parameter and another constructor which was initializing our member variables with parameters that we pass in this parameter list here. But in this lecture, let's take out this constructor that doesn't take any parameter and show you that when you set up your own constructor, the compiler is not going to generate a default constructor for you. And we're going to lose the ability to construct objects without passing parameters. The syntax we basically see here. We're going to say cylinder and say cylinder1. Let's use a lowercase c. And if we do this, you see that we have a squiggly line. The compiler is not going to generate an empty non-parameter taking constructor because it sees that we have a constructor here. This is how C++ compilers work. If they see that you have any constructor in your class, they're not going to generate a default empty constructor. And if we try to build, we're going to get an error that says something like, we don't have a constructor that can basically construct an object from the line here. It's going to say no matching function call for cylinder. You see here, it is trying to call a constructor that doesn't take any parameter, but we have no such constructor in our code. We could go in and put in that constructor and, for example, say cylinder and put an empty parameter list and put in an empty body. Now this line here is going to work because we have a default empty constructor. And if we build, you see that the build is going to be good. Okay, we are building fine. But having to type all this, if what you really want is an empty constructor, is too much typing. And in C++, we have a syntax we can use to let the compiler generate this kind of constructor for us. And the way we do that is say cylinder, and we say the name of the constructor, we say equals, and we say default. If we save this, the compiler is going to generate this constructor for us, and the line here is going to work. So let's bring this up and build again. We're going to build with GCC. You're going to see that the build is good, and we can bring up a terminal and clear and run rooster. We're not going to see anything because we're not printing the volume of our cylinder here, but we can do that. Let's call this cylinder1 to be consistent with what we did in the last few lectures. And we're going to say stdc out and print the volume of this cylinder. We're going to say volume and call our volume method. And now that we have this, we can build. We're going to use GCC to do that. The build is good. We can go down and clear and run rooster. We're going to see that we see our volume here. And this is really all I wanted to share with you in this lecture, that you can use this default syntax here to set up an empty default constructor for your classes. And one thing I haven't shown you is that your constructors have to be public to be able to be called like this. And to show you that, let's go up and actually change this to private and show you what happens. The moment we do this, we're going to get a squiggly line in the main function here. And if we try to build, but before we build, let's show you what Visual Studio Code is saying. It's going to say cylinder declared is inaccessible. So you see the constructor, which is declared inside our class as private, isn't accessible from the outside when we try to call it to build our cylinder objects. So for constructors to be usable on the outside here and build your objects, they have to be public. Let's build and see what GCC says about this. We're basically going to have the same error. The constructor is private within this context, so we can't really call it. So if we want our code to build, we need to make our constructors public. And this is something you need to know. Let's build again and see that the code is now building. The build is good. And this is really all I had to share in this lecture. We are going to stop here in this one. In the next one, we're going to see how we can use setters and getters to modify things about our class objects. Go ahead and finish up here and meet me there.